Do you ever have that thing happen to you when you react to something in a way you wish you hadn't, and you say to yourself, oh, I really don't know where that came from? Well, the truth is it probably came from your heart. Think about it this way. I've got a vase here full of Skittles, but if this vase were empty and I tipped it over, nothing would come out. The vase itself is not determining what comes out. It's what's inside it that determines what comes out. So if I were to shake or rattle this vase, all these Skittles would come flying out because they're what's in it. It's what's already in the vase that determines what comes out when it's shaken. And shaking, of course, exposes what's already in here. And it's the same with you and me. When we're under pressure, sometimes when we're not under pressure, what's already inside of us and inside of our hearts will come out. And we need to make sure that our hearts are healthy and that the toxic emotions that can do such damage to our hearts if we let them aren't allowed to be the boss of us. And today we're talking about one of those emotions. I think it's an emotion that all of us feel and all of us carry around with us to some degree or another. And that emotion is guilt. And by the end of this talk, we're going to discover some ways that we try to deal with our guilt on our own and how so often they don't really help us. And we're going to instead ask, is there a better way? And if you stick with this, by the end, I think you will have found that there is a better way. And I think that we will all find it to be totally and completely liberating for us. And this is true whether you would call yourself a believer when it comes to God, or a skeptic, a church person or not, whether you're a regular on this stream or you've stumbled across it. You know, guilt is the emotion that comes to us when we acknowledge that we have done something wrong, or we think that we've done something wrong. And there are some different kinds of guilt. There's false guilt. We feel guilty, but we're not. And there are all sorts of reasons why we might feel that way. Then there's the guilt that comes because we are guilty. We did do something wrong. And it's this second one that we're going to focus on today. And you know, guilt just weighs us down if it's unresolved. It throws our life off balance. Think of it a little bit like this. We're on the path of life, we're going along, and sometimes it's flat and the going is fine and we feel great. But sometimes life is hard and it feels like we're on a steep climb going uphill and it's painful going. But other times, life is great and we feel like we're on top of the world and there's amazing views all around us. Whatever the path of life feels like at any stage, flat, steep, admiring the view, it's much harder if we're lugging around unresolved guilt, like a battered old rucksack. And it's even more difficult if that rucksack is full of stuff that's weighing us down. Maybe things like the guilt that comes from knowing that a while ago we did something and it was really wrong and we're feeling really guilty about it. What about the guilt that comes from that thing that we said that just really hurt someone and messed them up? What about the guilt that comes from that secret behavior that is messing us up, that we're not telling anybody about, but we know is damaging relationships? Or what about the guilt that comes from missing that opportunity to do something that would really have helped us, or more importantly, would really have helped someone else? You know, when we have that kind of guilt going on in our lives, it's just like a really heavy rucksack that we're lagging around with us. All of this guilt, if left unresolved, becomes like this weight that we carry around. And even when the path of life is flat and easy, it still makes things more difficult. And when the path is steep, it makes it almost impossible. And even when life is amazing and we're enjoying the views, it's still there, dragging us down. It's still there in the background. You know, there are 3 strategies that we often employ to try to deal with this great weight of guilt that we're dragging around with us. Number 1, we deny it. We convince ourselves that we've got nothing to feel guilty about. We deny that it's a problem. We stuff it down so we don't have to think about it. I can't see this great pack on my back, so it can't be there. Number 2, we try to distance ourselves from it. We kind of create an excuse for it. We say, oh yeah, this rucksack, yeah, sure it's heavy. Yeah, sure it'd be easier if I was going up this mountain and I didn't have it. But where would I leave it? Or we create an excuse like this, that thing that I carry the guilt around for that's weighing me down, well, that just wasn't like me. Oh, I was young and stupid. I didn't know any better. My parents were just like that, and I learned it from them. You know, deep down, we know that we're guilty. We know that we did something wrong, and we know we're carrying this weight around, but we create a narrative that allows us to distance ourselves from it. The other strategy that we sometimes employ is to be defined by it. Me and this rucksack are so connected that I couldn't imagine being without it. It's just a part of me. This guilt is part of who I am. But it's really tough lugging this rucksack of guilt around with me everywhere I go. And the problem is that denying it, distancing ourselves from it, or being defined by it empowers it. And empowering guilt in our lives throws us off balance because it creates a debt-debtor relationship between us and other people. What I mean by that is this: when we commit a thing against another person, when we do something that we should feel guilty about because it wasn't good, when we hurt somebody, however unintentionally, it's like we've stolen something from them or we've taken something from them. When we hurt someone, we steal from them. We steal their time or their reputation or their self-esteem or something even worse, their childhood, their security or their physical or mental health. And suddenly there's a disparity in the relationship. And we know this because we say things like this: I owe them an apology. I owe them. I'm in debt to them. This thing has created an imbalance in the relationship, and it's created tensions. And sometimes that imbalance isn't huge, and it's temporary, and it's easily resolved with an apology. But in other situations, it requires a lot more than that. And the other way guilt throws us off balance is just the sheer weight of it. It's getting heavy now, this rucksack. We know this because of what we say when we finally resolve the guilt. We say, it feels like a weight has been lifted off me. The problem with unresolved guilt is that it throws our lives off balance, and we bring the debt and the weight everywhere we go, into the next season of life and into the next relationship, because our guilt travels with us. Denying, distancing, or being defined by it as strategies for dealing with guilt, they just don't work. They just empower it, actually. Wouldn't you like it if there was a better way? Wouldn't you like it if there was some way of dealing with our guilt that freed us to move on with our lives and not drag it into the past? And not drag the past all around into the future with us. To find a better way, we need to ask ourselves why we employ those three strategies first before anything else. And I think there's a really good reason why we come up with those narratives that allow us to deny, distance, or be defined by it, rather than to face it and embrace it. Because to face it and embrace it leaves us standing condemned. There's no way to undo the past, right? We can't undo that hurtful thing that we said. We can't unsay that hurtful remark. We can't be unfaithful. We can't undrink too much. We can't unwork too much. We can't be unangry. So we create one of these narratives and try to move on. But you and I, we know, if we're being really honest with each other, the past is not that easily left behind. Guilt is not that easily left behind. But there is some good news, which is a relief, right? Because I've just spent the first few minutes of this talk really depressing everyone, and actually I'm really surprised that you're still on this. We don't have to be defined by the past. Here's the good news. We don't have to be defined by the past. We don't have to deny or distance. There is a better way, and it's a way that Jesus offered. And I think it's one of the most compelling reasons to follow Jesus, to accept what he has to offer, because he offers us this better way. And if you're exploring faith or wondering who Jesus is or what he offers or wondering what Christianity is all about, I think this will be so helpful because it goes really to the heart of it all, and it gets to the heart of what the Christian faith is all about. And to find out what Jesus offers, we're going to hear the words of a man who knew more than most what guilt was, a man who had more regret than most of us will ever experience, in fact, more regret than perhaps most of us would ever experience combined. This is a man whose experiences left him so broken, so ashamed, and so guilty. His name was Paul. And before he was Paul, he was called Saul, Saul of Tarsus. And Saul of Tarsus was not a Jesus fan. In fact, his job was to arrest, torture, and in some cases imprison and even execute men and women whose only crime was to be followers of Jesus. And he did it all in the name of God. But Saul had this amazing encounter with God, and through it he became a Jesus follower himself, and he became known as Paul, not Saul. He became a part of the very community he'd sought to destroy, the people whose fathers and sons, mothers and daughters, brothers and sisters he had arrested and killed. Initially, those people were terrified of him and skeptical of this transformation, and rightly so. But instead of allowing this guilt to define him, instead of trying to spend every minute of every day trying to distance himself from it or deny it, Paul discovered a different way, a way offered to him by Jesus. And this is what he said when writing to some of those people he became friends with in a church in Rome. And I'm really keen about this. I don't want you to simply hear me reading words out of the Bible this morning, because this letter that Paul wrote, it's called Romans, and it's the New Testament part of the Bible. I don't want you to hear me simply reading words out of the Bible this morning. I want you to hear the words of a man who had more regret and more stuff to be guilty about than we can ever begin to imagine. And this is what he says in Romans chapter 8, reading from verse 1. It starts this. Paul says, "Therefore, there is now no condemnation." Wait, what? Even for people like you, Paul, even for people who have a whole load to feel guilty about, is there really a place or a space where our actual past is neither forgotten nor condemning, where it can be faced, where we can live with no condemnation? Is that really possible? How does that work? Where is that place or this space? Well, Paul goes on to tell us, "Therefore there is no condemnation for those who are in Jesus, in Christ Jesus. There is a place and there is a space where those who acknowledge their guilt to God and surrender to having Jesus as the boss of their lives stand uncondemned and are able to move forward in their lives without being weighed down." And what does this word "in" mean here? What does it mean when Paul says who are in Jesus? Well, it means those who have partnered with him in life, those who are following him, those who are allowing him to be the boss of their lives. Well, how does that work? Well, Paul goes on to tell us. He says, because, this is how it works like this: through Christ Jesus, the law of the Spirit who gives life has set you free from the law of sin and death. Let me just explain this for a minute. It works like this. Guilt and the things that cause it, our mess-ups and mistakes, our sin, those things that would enslave us, that would weigh us down, that would cause us to struggle, that would set us off balance, that would lead us down a route of destruction. They're referred to here as sin and death, because when we mess up or we hurt someone, we take something from them, and there's no way to undo that. We are guilty and we are stuck, and we can try to deny it or distance ourselves from it or be defined by it. That doesn't work. Guilt is then the boss of you and me. But in Jesus, there's a different path that sets us free from being enslaved to sin and the consequences of that. How does that work? Well, Paul goes on to tell us again. For what the law was powerless to do because it was weakened by the flesh. So let's just pause there for a moment. Until the time of Jesus, people were trying to atone for their guilt and mess-ups, their sin, by keeping a set of laws. And this was the basis of all kinds of different religious systems. There was this set of laws that if you kept it, it would get rid of the guilt and set you right with God. There were basically systems that said you just have to try harder to do more. But they didn't work, because trying harder usually ends in failure. You know this, right? How many times have you resolved to try harder to do something only to give it up after a while? How long do your New Year's resolutions last? Trying harder so often doesn't work. And actually, we have laws and rules today too. The laws in our society, the laws of marriage, the rules of the road, our personal rules about how we think we should behave, live, parent, and so on. But the only thing that laws can do, and I'm not saying they're bad, by the way, but the only thing that laws can do is set some kind of standard for how low we can go. And once we go too low and we break that law, those laws simply condemn us, or in some cases, punish us. But rules and laws, religious or otherwise, can't restore you. They can't set you free from your past. And in fact, they're a constant reminder of how we've messed up, of how guilty we are, of how weighed down and off balance we are. So the law was powerless to do. But what the law was powerless to do because it was so weakened by our human nature, God did. What the law was powerless to do, God did. And this is the really good news, that God stepped in to do what we couldn't do, what any laws or rules or systems of simply trying harder couldn't do, but God has done. How does that work? Well, he goes on to tell us. God did by sending his own son in the likeness of sinful flesh to be a sin offering. By the means by which God did this was by sending his own son, Jesus. This is why the fact that God came to live amongst us in the person of Jesus is so important. It's why it's so important to Christians, why it's so important to the Christian faith, and why I believe, it's so important for you, even if you wouldn't say you were a Jesus follower yet. God didn't send Jesus to earth just to show us how to live and love, although he did show us that. He came to take upon himself our likeness and what we deserved so that we could be free. You know, it really frustrates me that sometimes God is painted and portrayed as someone who wants to restrict us, impose stuff on us, enslave us. And we have to accept that sometimes those of us who are Christians and churches as well have painted that picture and portrayed that image by how we have behaved and how we have treated people. But that really frustrates me because actually God is the great liberator. God is the great freedom bringer. He sent Jesus to free us from the guilt and condemnation that we suffer from, and that weighs us down and would throw us off balance. We don't have to be trapped between either denying our guilt and distancing ourselves from it and living a lie and being defined by it. We don't have to be trapped by that. Because what the law couldn't do, God did by sending his son to be like us, and to be a sin offering. What does that mean? What that means is that Jesus took all of the sin and all of the guilt associated with it and all of the weight of that, and he lugged it up a hill so we don't have to. And he allowed it to be nailed to a cross with him and to die there with him. He took what we deserve upon himself. And that wasn't just our sin, our mess ups. It was even better than that. It was the condemnation associated with our sin. You see, the innocent Son of God took the weight of our guilt and the condemnation that goes with it so we could be free, so we could put it down. At the cross, something was condemned, but not you. God condemns sin and not us. And that means that God has restored us to a guiltless, free relationship with him. And we are guilty because we do mess up, we do sin. But we are not condemned. Is all of this really important? Is it a big deal? Isn't this all just theological words? Well, I wish we could ask Paul. I wish he was here today, and I wish we could ask him, this man who had so much to be guilty about and deserved such condemnation, whether this was a big deal to him. I wish we could ask him that. He'd say, yes, this is a really big deal. And when we don't have to lug this weight around with us through the rest of our lives, when we can put it down and not be condemned by it, it will feel like a really big deal. It's a really big deal for you and for those who are around you who get the impact of you bringing this weight into the rest of your life, into your relationships. When you step into that thing that Jesus has done for you, 4 things happen, I think, that make it a really big deal. Number 1, you forfeit the right to condemn yourself because you are not yours to condemn. When you step into this, what Jesus has done, guilt doesn't get to be the boss of you anymore because you have a brand new boss in God, and he says you are not condemned. And when that voice of shame wells up inside of us, we can say, yeah, I know I'm guilty, but I am not condemned. I have no right to condemn myself because my freedom has been bought at a great price. Number 2 consequence, your guilt will remind you, but it will not define you. Yes, I did it. Yes, we messed up. But that will not define us because we aren't what we do and we aren't what we did. God condemns sin but refused to condemn you. So when you're reminded of your worst sin, your worst guilt, it can be a pivot point, not to condemn yourself, but to look up in gratitude to God. One of the reasons we love to sing songs to and about God in church and through the live stream is because what we do in our sung worship is to use words that give us the opportunity to say thank you. Thank you for taking my sin and the condemnation that was due to me and dealing with it, so I am not condemned and I don't have to be defined by it. Thank you. Number 3, you forfeit the right to condemn others because that would make you a hypocrite. When we accept this and receive this, we forfeit the right to condemn others because that would just make us a hypocrite. Those who bring their own failures and mess-ups to God and find love and not condemnation, forgiveness and not judgment, should find it impossible to condemn anybody else. Number 4, we are free to make restitution without excuses. You know, it's not enough to face what we've done, to bring it to God and to ask him to forgive us and then think that everything is good. That's not what God wants from us in response to what he has done. We need to go back to the people we have hurt without excuses, stories, denials, and distances. You know, when we refuse to deal with our guilt, it weighs us down. When we try to deny or distance ourselves from it, it weighs us down. When we allow it to define us, it weighs us down. Our shame and our guilt become the boss of us, and we drag that through life. Instead, God invites us to step into the freedom that he offers because his son took the sin and condemnation on himself. So there is a better way, and it's his way. And in a relationship with God, we find a place and a space where we are no longer condemned, and instead we are free.